have never been to this part of Michigan before, and so I hear there's a polar vortex happening. So a great time to come, but it's so beautiful. And I grew up in Kentucky, and we would come up to Michigan, like the coast. We did it a couple of times for summer. First, like a little summer vacation, we'd drive up from Kentucky, and so I have a lot of good memories in Michigan. And yeah, so I grew up there, went to college there, and then pretty much graduated into the pandemic and decided that economics education was something that I really wanted to focus on. So the book that Doug was talking about came out about a year and a half ago. It's called In This Economy, How Money and Markets Really Work. And the idea is that, which I'm sure most of you probably agree with, is like we kind of all exist in this economy. Like we all buy coffee, we all go to work, we all have a car, we all try to have a house, but we're never really taught how any of that works. And so my book and my work online is an attempt to close that gap, to give people the tools that they need to understand the world and ultimately make better decisions. So ultimately everybody is a little bit better off. So yeah, that's me and kind of what I focus on.
Great. And just to reciprocate, I'm Doug Song, former CEO, co-founder of Duo Security. We were Michigan's first unicorn, first multi-billion-dollar exit. There have been, thank you. It was 2018, so it's nice to still get some applause for. Yeah. But there have been 12 more since, and that's the thing that people don't know, right? Other than the deal room folks. But there have been actually quite a number of successful exits here, but in a way that I think we need to see more impact, particularly around economic equity. So a large part of our work as a family office now is around what we call tech equity, or how technology can be the great equalizer versus a great divider. Because again, there's been some challenges we've seen on this nationally. But I want to start with some questions as we talk about this economy that we're in, and also in a room full of funders, founders, and folks who are risk takers. An economy only works when people are willing to sort of take the risks, right? To do some things and so forth. But you have a concept that now others have followed. I think Paul Krugman, others, on your vibe session concept. Yeah. But the notion again that even when sometimes things by the numbers are doing well, we don't feel good about it. Right. What's happening and why is that?
Yeah, so the Vibe session was this idea that I published a long time ago, so back in 2022. And the concept was meant to delineate between sentiment, so how people are feeling, and economic data. So the way that we measure the economy is through GDP, so gross domestic product. We measure it through inflation, we measure it through the labor market. And during that time in 2022, inflation was going down, the labor market was improving, GDP was going up, so the economy was growing, but people were feeling really, really bad. And so there was this huge disconnect between how we looked at the economy versus how people were feeling about it. And one thing that's really important to understand about the economy is that it is a manifestation thing. So how people feel impacts how they spend, impacts how the economy grows, because the economy is 70% consumer spending. So it's really important for a strong economy that people feel good. And so for the past 4 years, how long is that, 3 years? I've been trying to figure out this idea of like why sentiment is so disconnected from economic fundamentals. And right now, we're not in a vibe session anymore because economic data has deteriorated quite a bit. If you have recently graduated from college, it's pretty tough to get a job. Over half of 2024 college grads are unable to find work. And so, people are feeling bad for a reason now, so we're not in that situation anymore. Yeah.
We talked a little bit about how the University of Michigan has this survey of consumers, right? That's very important.
Such a good survey. Yeah.
And but this last result that they just had in the last month was pretty stunning in terms of the bifurcation, right, of the economy and sentiment in a way, particularly for 18 to 35-year-olds versus a lot of the rest. And you spoke to a little bit, but based on the Midwest, on your perspective of Midwest, what's your take on Midwest story right now? As again, Michigan has become a very purple state.
Yeah.
it has a interesting challenge of retaining its young people. In fact, I think for a time we had a Michigan Growth Office that was really trying to figure out what to do about the fact that we were the 49th state in terms of growth. Only West Virginia was losing population faster than Michigan. We're doing better now, but not by much. And so there's still some issues as we think about how young people think about what the future looks like in a place like Michigan. What's your take on Midwest more broadly?
Yeah, I mean, it's really tough. So grew up in Kentucky, went to school in Kentucky, was on there was this thing in Kentucky called the Governor's Scholars Program. And so essentially they take high school juniors and they stick them at a college for 5 weeks in the summer, and then you get essentially a full ride to a university in the state to try and keep the brains in the state. But by the time I graduated school, there really weren't a lot of job opportunities for me, so I had to move out to LA for a little bit to find a job. And so I think a lot of states in the middle of the country kind of suffer from that, where people who are looking for some sort of career path they think it makes more sense to go to the coastal states, so New York for finance, LA for other stuff. And so I think that is shifting, though, and we were talking about this a little bit in the green room, because housing costs have gotten so high in those places that it's pretty untenable to have an early stage career there. There's a very good paper called Negative Yield New York that was written a few years ago, and it was talking about how essentially housing has made it impossible for a lot of creatives to thrive, to succeed in places like New York. And so I think the Midwest is really going to benefit from that and hopefully retain more talent just because of the housing situation.
Well, there's some other sessions later today on housing, which I encourage you all to check out. Because again, although people have a brand, a notion around the Midwest and Michigan specifically around being more affordable, it's not always the case that that's the true. And there's a shortage that's been reported here in this state of hundreds of thousands of houses, homes that were short by. And we've seen other things that have been reported. I think the average first-time home buyer now is the age keeps climbing, or
38,
so
yeah.
38. And so you talked about how young people feel or are locked out, not only by housing, but also healthcare, education costs, and all the rest.
Yeah.
Do you think that's a temporary imbalance or sort of a permanent redesign, a structural sort of issue that we have to solve for?
Are these problems permanent? I mean, I hope not. I think a lot of people in this room are working pretty hard to make sure it's not permanent. Like you're working very hard to make sure it's not. But I mean, there is a housing panel later today, so I won't spend too much time on that. But I think that I interviewed the Deputy Secretary of the Treasury, Wally Adeyemo, back during the Biden administration, and one thing that he said was that it's zoning. That's really the biggest headache is we just make it really tough for people to build. And then Works in Progress, which is a great economic magazine, they had a piece about zoning that came out where they're like, listen, all of these problems really do stem from overregulation. And so I think that's the really tough part right now, is the things that should be easy are like really hard, and the things that should be hard, like gambling, are really easy. And so I think there needs to be some sort of rebalance, like some sort of friction. Like Binance, which is a cryptocurrency exchange, they now have kids accounts where you can open up a crypto account as a child. Maybe some people are backing that idea, but I think that's the thing that has to happen, is we need to even out that a little bit more. So I do have a lot of hope that these things can get better, like housing, like we're talking about it, which is the first step. And then I think healthcare is a different sort of beast. And then I think education is going through a really interesting problem where, the deindustrialized America of like the 1980s, because manufacturing jobs were leaving, as Detroit well knows, there was a premium on a college education, and so all of these college jobs became very, very important. Getting a college degree became very, very important because there really wasn't another path for people. But now with the threat of AI, college is having to rethink, like, what is the premium of a college education? Does it make sense to pay all of this money? How should students learn in the age of technology? And so that's my question mark about education, but I'm hopeful we'll figure it all out.
Living in a university town like we do in Ann Arbor, where it's the cottage industry, we have seen the escalating. There has been the higher ed bubble, for some time that is probably the last to burst, right? Like everything else is, right? With equities, the bonds, of housing, but then education, we're sort of waiting for the shoe to drop. But now, with all that's happened with federal funding, we're all sort of waiting because at least here in Michigan, U of M is the number 2 university in terms of research expenditure annually, nationally. Only Hopkins, spends more, $3 billion a year. In Arbor, it's 2.5, but we'll see for how much longer, right? As the federal funding as our country's commitment to science sort of wobbles. So you often say that they're kind of. They're basically two economies, right? You said of one of assets and one of wages.
Yeah.
And we're seeing things happen now as we think about other folks trying to solve for these kind of generational, sort of structural things, like I guess Trump accounts, for our kids. I don't know if you've seen that announcement from Michael Dell and all this, but apparently our kids will be playing the stock market too. How do you think that split shapes generational opportunity?
So there's a chart that I want to show.
Yeah.
Is it working?
I think.
Sorry, we were making sure it would work. Okay. Okay, great. So this is the chart of the distribution of wealth in the United States, and hopefully everybody in the back can see it. But essentially, the way that we think about the wealth in the U.S. is through housing, right? So for a very long time, a lot of people were like, if I buy a house, that's going to be where I have all my money and everything's going to be perfect and fine. And a lot of people have really benefited from that because home prices have skyrocketed post-pandemic. And so you can see that the bottom 50% of Americans, most of their wealth is tied up into their house. But when you look at the top 0.1%, most of their wealth is in corporate equities or it's in a business that they created. And so when we think about something like Trump accounts, which is that every baby born between 2025 and 2028 will get $1,000 given to them by the government in these little Trump accounts that they can take out when they're 18, it's interesting because it is good, right? It is a way to build wealth in the U.S. to have exposure to the stock market, but we're really banking a lot on the stock market as sort of the way that we provide a social safety net. So I think that's my worry with things like over-reliance on equities as a way to build wealth. It's important. People should have some exposure to equities, but we still have to have some element of a social safety net too. And so that's the concern that a lot of people have. And then when you think about the way that the stock market is composed right now, 20% of the stock market is AI companies, 75% of S&P 500, so the top 500 companies in the U.S., all of their earnings, 75% of their earnings growth is coming from AI. And so if the AI trade ends up not working, you're going to have a bunch of babies, maybe their $1,000 isn't worth all that much. And that's why baby bonds are somewhat important too, some sort of diversification for the babies. So I think there's a lot of ways that we could talk about this. I think my answer to this question is that equity exposure is important, but we also have to invest in infrastructure, invest in the social safety net too.
Absolutely. So, given that we're in a room full of largely tech-oriented folks,
good.
Tech has seen obviously huge value creation, and I know that for my own family, it was a big thing. My dad had a liquor store in Baltimore, and he's not living today, but I would have been very curious about how all this happened for us. But there's been limited value circulation, right? I mean, obviously, a place like Duo, in most startups, people have equity. We did mint, 100 millionaires were when we exited and so forth, and many of them gone on to build their own companies and so forth. But But is there a different way? If we were to measure the economy as, there a former candidate for office, for the presidential office, Andrew Yang had sort of thought about other ways to this, or countries like Bhutan with their happiness index and so forth. But what would it look like to measure the economy by shared prosperity instead of sort of aggregate growth? Is there a different way to look at this?
I mean, it's an interesting question. There's a paper that came out in 2023 called The Worldwide Divergence of Values. And it sort of touches on the idea that once everybody, the US is materially quite well off, right? Most people are okay, people have some sort of path, especially compared to the rest of the world, right? There's still a lot of pain and economic pain in the United States, but compared to the rest of the world, it's materially pretty well off. But what this paper kind of gets at is that it's not enough to just have economic stability. You also have to have meaning and purpose. And so that's a little bit more difficult to measure. And I think that's where this idea of what does it actually look like to be prosperous, what does that mean? The American dream is having to redefine itself right now because housing is so expensive, because entry-level jobs, getting your foot on the first rung of the economic ladder is difficult, because it is, there's fertility rates are going down, people are marrying much later, which is fine, but what we think about it as the 1950s American dream is shifting, and so we are going to have, I think, an opportunity to redefine prosperity and what does it look like to succeed. It's going to be different for everybody. But I don't know. I've spent a lot of, when I saw your question list, I spent a lot of time thinking about that question, and I'm curious what you think as somebody who thinks a lot about this. What should prosperity be?
I don't know that I have the answer for it, but I think what I would wager is that there's a different approach to how we get to that, which is in community. I think it's really hard sometimes in Michigan to look across the border at states like Ohio and Indiana, and I'm being from Ann Arbor, I'm like, fuck Ohio. but we love Ohio. We love Ohio, and our friends from Columbus are here, and thank you for coming, because sorry, we just had a game that happened recently. But Columbus, if people didn't know, Columbus has been the second fastest growing city in the U.S. Right? In the last 10 years, Columbus added 335,000 people in population. And a large part actually through immigration, even, international immigration. Columbus is actually kicking ass right now, which is really hard. They added 2 Ann Arbors to Ohio, to Columbus in that time frame. And part of how they did that is, and again, it's also hard because, Les Wexner, not my role model. He was one of Jeffrey Epstein's biggest backers and all that kind of stuff. But he also had started something that I think was a smart thing to do decades ago called the Columbus Partnership, which is a superstructure of leadership, cross-sectoral, business, academic, and philanthropic leadership all coming together to define that. What would shared prosperity for their region look like? And so for 30 plus years, they've been executing a consistent strategy on how to actually do that from all those different lenses. I think the only equivalent we have here is actually here in Grand Rapids, where this is a community that's actually done that in a way that is somewhat comparable. And so you have a lot of families and a lot of businesses and philanthropists that have all, willed things into existence with shared vision. Like the medical mile that's here, or Grand Rapids has a tech strategy. Kent County has a housing plan. I mean, they're doing things that you sort of look at and it's sort of enviable, but not irreproducible. We could be doing these things in places like Detroit or the UP and so forth, but it does require the social capital.
Yeah.
And so I think that's the part that, in your reference, we're so strong in human capital. We have all the intellectual capital, we have the physical capital, we have even the financial capital. Like actually, Michigan is a place that's, we built the middle class. There's a lot of latent wealth here, but often what we struggle with is the social capital. How do we bridge the divides? And sometimes they're just as simple as east-west. Like the fact that you all showed up, you have a bunch of east-siders, Detroit folks and Ann Arbor folks here in Grand Rapids, but also folks from Wisconsin, Minneapolis, from Chicago, Indiana. But those communities we talk about startup ecosystems. Ecosystems are all the institutions and programs and buildings, but a community is people, and it's relationships. And we don't do enough sometimes to cultivate those bridges that then help us, again, achieve greater things than any of us could do together. And so part of what I think communities are built on, though, are narratives, right? Communities are really built around stories, and often we do need a better story, because sometimes a place like Detroit, other people tell the story for us, and they really screw it up. They tell stories that are not really indicative of all the success and amazing sort of heroism and great work that people are doing. And so you've managed to make economics accessible through a kind of storytelling, through memes, right, which are their own sort of metaphors, vibes. Why do you think storytelling is so important to economic literacy?
Oh, geez. I mean, I think that, humans, the way that we relate to one another is through stories. Like, I can toss all this data out there, but it doesn't resonate until it's wrapped around something that people can relate to and say, like, okay, that's how my life works. I understand what this person's trying to talk to me about. And so I think that's the biggest part of all of it, is that a lot of people feel like they're not able to be a part of the story right now. Like, they don't have a role, they feel cast out, they feel like they just don't belong. And so that's, like, in my little tiny world of economics education, that's what I try to do, is like, okay, so you are a part of the economy, it is part of your story, you should understand it as best you can. But yeah, I mean, Morgan Housel, who wrote The Psychology of Money, he's like the master of this, where everything about money is rooted in some sort of story. The economy is so incredibly personal, right? Like, everybody has their own inflation rate, their own interaction with the labor market, their own, interpretation of GDP growth. And so the more that you can sort of build story and narrative around that and connect people through that commonality so they can understand their own personal economic story, the better. Yeah.
You have a very simple definition for what economy is that I love, which is peopling around.
Yeah.
Which I think is exactly what it is. So any thoughts on what a Midwestern story of the future economy might really look or feel or sound like for us? Something that might be more grounded or inclusive or regenerative, because personally, when I sort of look at all this stuff, being a tech person, I look at things like Detroit, right, which has had just an amazing journey. But as Detroit goes so does the country, and many of the solutions that we're looking for are grounded in the way that Detroit has persisted, right, and been resilient and found its own path to solutions in community. But do you have thoughts on kind of what that might look like for us as a region in terms of the Midwest?
Like what the Midwest story would look like?
Yeah, what it might look, feel, sound like?
I mean, so I don't know. Like, one thing I've been all over the country over the past year. So I've been on the road. I counted for 36 weeks over the past year, like, talking about this book. It's been really fun. But I've met so many people. I was on the road for 30 days as of like 2 weeks ago. So I was gone for essentially a whole month. I had a little bit of a break, but I was in I think 11 cities over the 30 days. And one thing I really noticed is that there is this like huge want to try. Like, people really want to push forward. They really want to do stuff. And I think oftentimes, like, the story that we might hear in the news, just because that's how sometimes news works, is it is really negative, that everybody is checking out, they're giving up, they're gambling, whatever. And I think that, people really do care. And so I think the Midwest is really well known for that. Like, where I grew up in Kentucky, a lot of people don't ever leave, right? People stay, they build, they create that community. And I think that's what the Midwest has in just spades, is like that cohesiveness and that ability to tell a story based on the history of where it's been. Like, Detroit knows what pain feels like and is able to now teach, I think, other places in the country, like LA, that are going through some sort of economic downturn. So that doesn't quite answer your question, but I think that gets like to the thematics of it. Yeah.
So, as we think about, again, what this next economy or the new economy will really look like or how it will do for people, if you were designing economic policy for places like Detroit, Grand Rapids, Ann Arbor, or other cities in the Midwest, what would you do differently to support the next economy?
Well, at first I'd fix zoning. I would fix zoning. That'd be which is, it's harder said than done, right? But that would be the absolute first thing. I would love to never hear that word again. But I think that would be, so like if you think, there's a good paper from Works in Progress again called The Housing Theory of Everything that I'm sure many of you have probably stumbled across or read. And it essentially says that if people feel like they don't have the foundation of a stable place to live, it's going to be very difficult for them to invest in a local community, to have a career path, to think about having kids, getting married, whatever. And so I think like solving housing is like the number one problem that the US faces. I think going back to the very beginning of our conversation around sentiment is like if we fixed housing, I think it would really fix sentiment, because like the number one thing that I hear from young people is they're like, I don't feel like I'm a part of this economy because there is no way I'm ever going to be able to buy a house. And in the US, as this chart shows, like buying a house is a way that people build wealth, number one, but it is also a way that you belong to a community and you invest and you have your 30-year, perhaps a 50-year mortgage, depending on if that happens. But I have a chart about that too, if anybody's curious. But anyway, so I think that's like the number one policy I would address is housing. And then I think I would really think through education. So I'm a little bit biased, but I think economics education is really important. Right now, students are so crammed in their school days that they don't actually have a lot of space for economics education. They're so busy with history and with science and with health class that it's actually very difficult for teachers to fit in econ. More and more states are requiring some sort of financial literacy, some sort of economic literacy course, but it's still tough, I think, for the students to get a grasp of like, what is a budget? How does that apply? So that's something that I think is important. And I think if we solve that, if people have the language to understand the economy that they're a part of, so when they hear on the news like inflation is going up or going down, that won't sound overwhelming. They'll know what that means. They'll know the decisions that they have to make. And so I think those would be the two policies that I would address everywhere, is housing and econ education.
All right,
Yeah.
Kyla for president.
Oh, no.
Well, Michigan is one of those states where, governor had amended again financial
But
education.
it's tough for the teachers to like fit it into.
Well, that's why we need you. We need the kids on, because we got to meet them where they're at. They're on Instagram. They're on,
Yeah.
If you want to do like a educational series that is rolled out through the Michigan school systems, let us know.
Yeah.
So, one thing that I'm also really curious about as is transpiring here, and here in Grand Rapids, I've been fortunate to have partnered up with some friends. There's a fund here called OXO, but they're a long strategy private equity fund, and not the kind of folks that you would, not the traditional kind of 3-year flip kind of thing, but the long-term buy, hold, more almost permanent capital kind of strategy. But we came into this with some other West Michigan families, like the DeVosses and some other folks that are buying businesses, 20, 50 million revenue, that are family-owned businesses, that the parents who need to retire want to retire, but the kids don't want. And it's part of a $7 trillion silver tsunami happening in this country, right, of sort of generational sort of transfer. But the way it's happened sometimes in Michigan has been really difficult. We see companies coming in that are sort of the 3-year flip kind of private equity folks or foreign sort of buyers. And sometimes these are asset sales for the land, the factories, the machines, the IP, the customers, but not the people. And it sometimes hollows out, right, the communities that are served by these generational businesses. And so part of what we've been doing is just trying to buy them, keep them together for longer, and then just see again if we can't help continue to see them grow and pivot towards something else, or find other ways that we could look at other models. Like in Ann Arbor, we have famous businesses like Zingerman's, which is sort of the I don't know, it's kind of they brought the world with a very high carbon footprint to Ann Arbor and to Michigan in terms of food, but they are shifting to a worker-owned business, right? As the principals move
like
on.
an ESOP?
More than ESOP.
More than
It'll be a full worker-owned business.
Wow,
And so there's kind of cooperative models, neighborhood scale investment, other kind of local capital, like families. That we had a family office dinner last night. We're rounding up a bunch of folks who are doing some really interesting things to try to, again, build prosperity, right? Where not only give where they live, but also see sustainable sort of impact and growth and participation this way. To reinvest in place is something that we're all trying to figure out. Are there things that you're seeing on a national level of trends like that might be other ways that capitalism, which is the worst of all systems, except every other, could be more community and people-oriented than just capital?
Wait, can capitalism fix itself? I don't know. That's like a whole body of work that people have spent many years trying to figure out. I mean, I think this is not going to be a good answer, but I think we're really reckoning with this with the AI situation, where the gains of AI are really privatized, right? So like the companies are really making just mega bucks, and then the losses are really socialized. So local communities that now have the data center situation happening. I was driving the van from the airport to Enterprise, where I rented a car with my fiance. There was a radio show on, and they were talking about all of the people that are protesting the data centers. So I think that is like going to be a really big moment where people wake up and they're like, okay, like when is enough enough? I think another big tipping point will be the prediction markets. I don't know if anybody's been following that, but those are causing controversy. And I think when AI and the prediction markets were first starting, like people were like, oh, fine, like this is another just capitalism thing. It's just going to be how it is. But I think people are realizing that they have some agency and some element of pushback in technology that they don't want around. And so I think to the point of like the silver tsunami and sort of like what role should private equity have, like how can we think about rebuilding businesses, I think people are sort of realizing that they have a voice in this economy and that they have something to say and that they can invest in the local businesses, in the local communities. So that's what I've been noticing. And I think around the country, people are deciding that, and they're starting small businesses. Like we saw small businesses really spike post-COVID. I think with the silver tsunami, and I'm curious if like you've run into this, the problem is training, right? So a lot of people do want to take over these businesses, but the bureaucracy of training kind of gets in the way. Is that correct?
Yeah, but what's interesting is, I sit down at the Zeller Institute at the Ross B School at University of Michigan, and they have a whole program now that's actually really one of the fastest growing in the B School around ETA, or entrepreneurship through acquisition. But people looking to buy into entrepreneurship and owning things. And there's there had been a prior era of the search kind of funds and backing individuals to go find those companies that will back you and you'll be the CEO and all that stuff. But now you're sort of seeing other ways that people are doing these things. And so there's a lot of that happening right now, which is pretty interesting. Technology is being used to drive efficiencies in some of those things where, sometimes it is hard to run things like a small veterinary clinic or a small auto body shop or a tow truck service, whatever. But sometimes acquirers with technology are able to then build kind of, the kind of platforms that make these businesses much more efficient, but also just much more effective, because then the veterinarians can just be the doctor and not have to worry about doing the billing and doing all the other things, right? And so those are things that I'm seeing of technology coming in and helping in ways that are sort of aggregate. Like the largest IPO in the NASDAQ last year was a Michigan company that basically nobody knows. Lineage Logistics. Lineage was the former founder or CEO of Conway Trucking, which was a $4 billion exit to XPO Logistics, of the big logistics company out of Ann Arbor. They're based in my backyard. And like most of those kind of companies, they're like a computer network with trucks at the edges, right? Software driven. And after that exit, he ended up doing this company where he just rolled up all the world's cold storage supply chain for things like food and medicine, blood, all this kind of stuff, with chain of custody, right? So that again, because when it's temper control, you don't want something to get hot and then cold and hot and cold. It's got to And so they did that in the IPO, $35 billion IPO last year. And no one even knew that was a Michigan company. You know, this is the story part of, you know, our challenge, that we have a lot more going on here sometimes than anyone, and even ourselves, give credit for. But I do think it's an exciting time, and I think we have so much of the opportunity sitting before us. If only we just sometimes get our own way with the regulatory or those kind of things, or get better organized. And so one thing that I'd be curious about, you know, what you're seeing also out there, you know, because when we met in Baltimore, where I'm from, it was at under Chattanooga rule. But the notion of the conference is sort of around sort of worker power and you know, not because this was the birthplace of the American labor movement, right, which did build middle class, and we are at a time where, you know, labor and capital, you know, are sort of these don't know where to find themselves, right, in sort of conversation, and we have to find other ways in which we are thinking about how we can set up a shared agenda for shared prosperity, right, in this. But I think what we're really lacking is sort of the organizing capability for a lot of these things, and even culturally. I mean, any children of the 80s here? Okay, yeah. So you all remember, like, that was like a great time for music, right? It was like it was maybe the best time, and like the golden era of hip hop in the 90s. But you know, all the political rap and punk rock and all this, like, people had something to say. I look at today's artists, I'm like, I can't even figure out what half, like the mumble rappers, like, what are you even saying? Like, I don't. Yeah. But, you know, like, where is the sort of drive to sort of organize, the voice, and, you know, are there ways, as you go around talking to young people, where you're seeing sort of organizing movements and stuff? Because we've seen some, you know, but they're sort of in the old model, like SIU and, you know, the workers that are kind of organizing to unionize at places like Starbucks or Amazon and so forth. But there's other things happening too, or should be, but I don't feel like there's energy sort of like culturally around this stuff. Your thoughts?
No, there was a piece in the New York Times about why boomers are protesting and why Gen Z isn't. And I didn't love the takeaway of the piece because I think it was defeatist in a way, but it was essentially that Gen Z is defeated and that they feel like there is no path forward. I don't think that's true. I think you can talk to young people and like feel the fire and but that
Stay up.
No, totally. But I think the problem with the music and the art of it all is that now you're beholden to an algorithm. And I, as somebody who posts sometimes political content on TikTok, I get banned on there all the time for talking about China. And so I think you're just like beholden to a new set of rules because of the way that the platforms work, which is like a whole separate problem and could be a whole separate conversation. And I think these so my fiance works in music, and he talks a lot about how like it's starting to pop up again. Like he's starting to see it, he's starting to feel it. And so I do think like that's where the fire has to start from, is the art scene, like what people are writing, what they're creating. And we're starting to see that more and more as this pushback. Like the post-pandemic, like everybody kind of went a little nuts, I think. Nobody really knew what was happening. And so I think people are sort of getting their bearings, getting their footing. There's something really to respond to right now, and so I think it's going to start happening. Like it feels like it's bubbling up. The amount of pushback that I hear on a daily basis about what people are upset about, it's going to spill over, I think, pretty soon. So I'm very optimistic about that part, and it'll be a different form of organizing for sure. Yeah.
We'll stand up Midwest because we got something to say. You know, a lot of the problems if the country faces, we've felt first, but also means that we're the people we've been looking for. The solutions we'll define. Yeah. We'll decarbonize the world from the Midwest. We'll fix housing from the Midwest. We'll do all these things. This is our opportunity. And so I want to thank Kyla for coming and sharing a bunch of your wisdom for us. But please give a warm thank you for Kyla.